Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed listening with closed eyes or finding solace in these stories as your day winds down, I'm grateful you're spending this peaceful time here with me. Perhaps you're wrapped in a soft blanket, a warm cup of tea cooling beside you, or maybe you're walking through the gentle darkness of your own neighborhood, letting these voices from the past accompany you. Wherever you are, I invite you to let your mind drift with me across oceans and decades, to a city where East met West in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking, to Shanghai in the twilight of the 19th and dawn of the 20th centuries. Tonight's story isn't one of grand political movements or celebrated victories. Instead, we'll walk quietly through the narrow alleyways and opulent parlors where ordinary people faced an extraordinary darkness, the creeping, silent tragedy of opium addiction that wrapped itself around thousands of lives like morning mist around the Huangpu River. If you've been following these late-night journeys through forgotten history, you know we often find ourselves drawn to the shadows where the most human stories hide. Tonight is no different. We'll meet individuals whose names history has largely forgotten, but whose struggles echo through time with a resonance that might surprise you with its familiarity. Picture, if you will, Shanghai in 1895. The city breathes with the rhythm of two worlds learning an uneasy dance together. Gas lamps flicker along the Bund, casting dancing shadows on cobblestones still damp from the afternoon rain. The air carries the mingled scents of jasmine tea, sandalwood incense, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that seems to seep from certain doorways like a whispered secret. In the international settlement, Victorian mansions stand proudly beside traditional Chinese courtyard houses, their architectural conversations speaking of compromise and collision. Horse-drawn carriages navigate streets where rickshaws dart between pedestrians carrying paper lanterns that bob like fireflies in the gathering dusk. This is a city where fortunes are made in tea and silk, where missionaries share streets with merchants, and where beneath the surface of this bustling prosperity, a quiet epidemic is taking root, spreading from mansion to tenement, from businessman to laborer, from parent to child, with a democracy of destruction that recognizes no boundaries of class or culture. Let me introduce you to some of the people who lived within this contradiction, who found themselves caught between worlds in more ways than one. She was 23 in the spring of 1897, with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold starlight when she smiled and hands that moved like water when she painted the intricate landscapes she sold to foreign visitors. Mei Lin's story began, as so many do, with the best of intention. Her husband, Chen Wei, was a silk trader who traveled frequently between Shanghai and the interior provinces. The separations were long and lonely, and Mei Lin found herself spending evening after evening in their small apartment above the shop, listening to the city's night sounds, the distant laughter from tea houses, the clip-clop of late carriages, the occasional song drifting from a nearby opera house. It was during one of these solitary evenings that her neighbor Mrs. Jiang knocked softly at her door. Mrs. Jiang was a kind woman in her 50s, the widow of a successful merchant, and she had noticed Mei Lin's loneliness with the gentle perception that comes from having experienced it herself. "Child," she said, settling herself carefully on Mei Lin's small wooden chair, "I know these evenings are difficult when Chen Wei is away. Perhaps you would like to join me and some of the other ladies. We gather sometimes just to talk and, well, to ease the weight of waiting." What Mrs. Jiang didn't say, what she perhaps didn't fully understand herself, was that their evening gatherings had evolved into something more than conversation. The opium pipe, passed quietly between friends, had become as natural as sharing tea. It was medicine for the soul, they told themselves, a gentle balm for the ache of loneliness, the weight of unfulfilled dreams, the strange melancholy that seemed to settle over Shanghai like fog from the river. For Mei Lin, that first evening was a revelation. The opium didn't make her forget her loneliness. Instead, it transformed it into something beautiful, something almost sacred. The emptiness in her chest became a vast, peaceful space where her thoughts could float like clouds. The silence of her apartment became music. The waiting became meditation. She began joining Mrs. Jiang's circle twice a week, then 3 times. Then every evening Chen Wei was away. When he returned from his trips, she found she could maintain the gentle floating feeling with just a small amount before sleep, just enough to soften the sharp edges of daily life, to make the ordinary world shimmer with a kind of poetry. Chen Wei noticed the change gradually. Mei Lin seemed more serene, more accepting of his long absence. Her paintings took on a dreamlike quality that actually improved their sales to Western collectors who found them mysteriously evocative. She smiled more often, though sometimes he caught her gazing at nothing with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his heart clench. But it was the morning he found her still sitting at her easel at dawn, paintbrush motionless in her hand, eyes fixed on something he couldn't see, that he began to understand. The small clay pipe on the table beside her, the sweet smell that clung to her clothes, the way she startled when he spoke her name as if she was traveling back from somewhere very far away. Across the city, in the international settlement, in a modest boarding house that catered to European professionals, lived James Hartwell, a 35-year-old Englishman who taught at one of Shanghai's new Western-style schools. James had come to China with the fervent hope of making a difference, of bridging cultures through education, of finding in this exotic land a sense of purpose that had eluded him in the grey streets of Manchester. James was everything a Victorian gentleman should be: learned, well-mannered, impeccably dressed, despite his modest salary. His letters home to his sister in England spoke of fascinating students, exotic customs, and the thrilling challenge of building something new in this rapidly changing city. What those letters didn't mention was the gnawing pain in his stomach that had begun 6 months after his arrival, or the way his hands shook in the morning until he could steady them with the medicine Dr. Morrison had prescribed. Morrison was a Scottish physician who ran a small clinic serving the foreign community. He was a good man, genuinely devoted to helping his patients, but he was also a product of his time and training. When James had come to him complaining of persistent stomach pain, difficulty sleeping, and a general feeling of nervous exhaustion, what we might now recognize as the symptoms of severe anxiety and culture shock, Dr. Morrison had done what any respectable physician would do. He had prescribed laudanum, that miracle tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that seemed to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. Just a few drops in water before meals, Dr. Morrison had said kindly. It will settle your stomach and calm your nerve. Many of us find the adjustment to Chinese life rather overwhelming at first. James had been grateful for the relief the laudanum provided. The constant knot of anxiety in his chest loosened. Food became palatable again. He could sleep through the night without jolting awake to the unfamiliar sounds of the Chinese city outside his window. His teaching improved as he felt more confident and relaxed with his student. But somewhere between the 3rd and 4th month of treatment, James began to notice that the prescribed dose wasn't quite enough anymore. The stomach pain returned earlier in the day. The anxiety crept back with increasing persistence. He began taking an extra dose at midday, then another in the evening, then small sips throughout the day, whenever the world felt too sharp, too immediate, too real. By winter of 1898, James was consuming nearly 10 times his original prescription. He had learned to visit multiple doctors complaining of various ailments to secure additional bottles. He had discovered that certain Chinese merchants in the old city could provide pure opium for a fraction of what the Western pharmaceuticals cost. He told himself he was being economical, practical. He was managing his condition, maintaining his dignity, fulfilling his duties as a teacher. His students loved him. He had become more patient, more gentle in his corrections, more understanding of their struggles with English pronunciation and Western concepts. What they didn't know was that their beloved Miss Hartwell often stood at the blackboard with his hands clasped behind his back, not from scholarly authority, but to hide their trembling, that his kind, distant smile often masked the fact that he was desperately calculating how many hours remained until his next dose. James's landlady, Miss Cooper, was a practical Yorkshire woman who had followed her husband to Shanghai and stayed on after his death to run the boarding house. She noticed things: the way James's curtains stayed drawn until afternoon on Sundays, the increasing number of empty medicine bottles in his wastebasket, the sweet medicinal smell that seemed to cling to his room despite his meticulous cleanliness. But Mrs. Cooper had also lost a son to the opium dens of London's Docklands. She recognized the signs with the terrible clarity of experience, and she found herself facing an impossible choice: expose a good man's private struggle and likely destroy his career, or remain silent and watch him disappear by degrees into the same fog that had claimed her boy. In one of Shanghai's most prestigious neighborhoods, in a compound where traditional Chinese architecture embraced carefully manicured gardens, lived the Zhou family. Zhou Daming was a silk merchant whose business had flourished under the new trade agreements with foreign powers. His success had brought not only wealth, but also the responsibility of maintaining face, of being an example to other Chinese families navigating this new world where ancient customs met modern commerce. His son Zhou Jiangyu was 25 and everything a traditional Chinese father could hope for in an heir. Brilliant, educated in both classical Chinese literature and modern business practices, fluent in English and French, respectful to his elders while being progressive enough to succeed in Shanghai's changing economy. Jiang Yu managed several of his father's business ventures with skill that impressed even their foreign partners, but success, as Jiang Yu was discovering, could be its own kind of prison. The weight of being the perfect son, the model of successful cultural adaptation, the bridge between his family's traditional values and Shanghai's modern realities. It pressed down on him like stones, growing heavier each day. There were the business dinners where he smiled and nodded while foreign merchants made casual jokes about Chinese customs. The family gatherings where elderly relatives questioned whether all this Western influence was corrupting their value. The pressure to marry well, to continue the family line, to honor traditions while embracing progress, all of it balanced on his shoulders with the precarious grace of an acrobat on a high wire. Jiang Yu's introduction to opium came through his work. Business entertaining in Shanghai often included visits to high-class smoking establishments, elegant parlors where merchants seal deals over pipes of the finest quality opium while discussing trade routes and profit margin. It was considered sophisticated, a sign of success and refinement, as different from the squalid opium dens of the poor districts as French wine was from rice liquor. At first, Jiang Yu participated only when business required it, a few draws from a pipe during lengthy negotiations, just enough to show respect for the customs while maintaining his
focus on the deals at hand. But gradually he began to notice how the opium transformed those pressure-filled business meetings into something almost pleasant. Conversations flowed more smoothly. The constant anxiety about representing his family well faded into a warm, confident glow. Problems that had seemed insurmountable during the day appeared manageable, even simple through the gentle haze of the smoke. Soon Jiang Yu was suggesting business dinners at the smoking houses. Then he was visiting them alone, telling himself he was cultivating relationships, maintaining important contacts. The truth, which he admitted only in his most honest moments, was that the opium parlor was the only place where he could simply exist without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. His father began to notice small changes. Business documents that used to be completed with meticulous care now sometimes contained small errors. Jiang Yu, who had always been punctual to the point of arriving early, began showing up just on time, and then occasionally late. His eyes, which had always been sharp and focused during their discussions, sometimes seemed to be looking at something just beyond his father's shoulder. Zhao Daming was not a naive man. He had built his business by being observant, by reading people and situations with careful attention. He knew about the smoking parlors, knew that many successful men in Shanghai had found solace there. He also knew, with the terrible clarity of a parent's love, that his son was disappearing by degrees into that smoke-filled world. The conversation came on an autumn evening, and father and son sat in the family's private courtyard, the air scented with chrysanthemums and the distant smell of cooking from the kitchen. Zhao Daming had waited until the household was quiet, until they could speak without the possibility of servants or family members overhearing. "My son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years and love and fear, "I think it is time we talked honestly about the path you are walking. What makes the opium crisis of old Shanghai particularly heartbreaking is not just the individual stories of addiction, but the way each person's struggle sent ripples through entire families, entire communities, like stones dropped in still water." Mei Lin's husband Chen Wei found himself trapped in an impossible situation. His business required long trips, but each time he returned he found his wife a little further away from him. The woman who had once waited eagerly for his stories of distant cities now seemed to prefer her own internal journeys to anything the real world could offer. He tried confronting her directly, pouring out her opium supply and demanding she stop. The result was 3 days of such profound physical and emotional agony that Chen Wei, watching his wife shake and weep and beg for relief, finally went to Mrs. Zhang himself to procure more of the drug. How could he cause such suffering to someone he loved? How could he torture his wife in the name of saving her? Instead, he tried gradual reduction, carefully measuring out smaller and smaller amounts. But Mei Lin, with the cunning that addiction grants its victims, soon found ways to supplement what he provided. She sold her paintings, her jewelry, small items from their household, telling Chen Wei that business was slow or that she had given gifts to friends. The lies came so naturally that sometimes she believed them herself. Their conversations became careful negotiations around the enormous unspoken presence of her addiction. Chen Wei learned not to ask too many questions about how she spent her days, and Mei Lin learned to time her smoking so that she appeared most normal during the brief periods when he was home. The tragedy was that they still loved each other deeply. In her clear moments, Mei Lin could see the pain in her husband's eyes and feel genuine anguish at what she was putting him through. In his quiet moments, Chen Wei could remember the woman he had married, and feel such fierce protectiveness that he would do anything, including enabling her addiction, to keep her from suffering. Perhaps no aspect of Shanghai's opium crisis was more heartbreaking than its effect on children, who learned lessons about adult behavior that no child should have to learn. In Mrs. Zhang's neighborhood, her 8-year-old grandson, Little Tiger, became expert at recognizing the signs that told him whether his grandmother would be present enough to prepare his meals or help him with his schoolwork. On good days, when she had smoked just enough to be calm but not yet dreamy, she was the most wonderful grandmother imaginable, patient with his questions, creative with stories, generous with small treats and surprises. But Little Tiger also learned to prepare simple meals for himself, to complete his homework without help, and to explain to teachers and neighbors that his grandmother was resting when she spent entire days lying motionless on her bed, staring at patterns only she could see in the ceiling above. He learned to hide the small amounts of money his parents sent for his care, because he had discovered that when his grandmother's medicine ran out, any money in the house would disappear to purchase more. He learned to recognize the men who came to deliver packages to his grandmother, and to make himself scarce during those visits. He learned that love and reliability could exist in the same person as unreliability and absence. Most heartbreakingly, Little Tiger learned that the adults he depended on could disappear while sitting right next to him, traveling to places where his voice couldn't reach them, where his needs became distant, unimportant things that could be attended to later. always late. In the international settlement, James Hartwell's students began to adapt to their teachers' changing patterns. They learned that Mr. Hartwell was most patient and creative during the middle hours of the morning, and most likely to be irritable and distracted in the late afternoon. They learned to save their most difficult questions for the good times, and to work quietly during the times when their beloved teacher seemed to be struggling with something invisible and exhausting. Some of the older students, particularly those whose families had their own experience with opium, recognized what they were seeing. They began to take care of Mr. Hartwell in small ways, organizing his papers when his hands shook too much to manage them neatly, redirecting conversations when he seemed confused or distant, creating small diversions when his distress became too obvious. These children learned compassion, but they also learned that the adults responsible for their care could become people who needed caring for themselves. They learned responsibility too early and trust too late. They learned that love sometimes meant pretending not to see what was clearly visible, and that helping someone could mean participating in their self-destruction. Behind every individual story of addiction in old Shanghai was a complex economy that profited from human suffering while often believing itself to be providing a humanitarian service. Morrison, the Scottish physician who had first prescribed laudanum to James Hartwell, was a good man caught in the medical understanding of his time. He genuinely believed he was helping his patients manage pain and anxiety with one of the most effective medicines available. When James began requiring larger and more frequent prescriptions, Dr. Morrison saw it as a natural progression of treatment, rather than the development of addiction. The medical profession of the 1890s had little understanding of addiction as a disease. What we now recognize as dependency was often viewed as a failure of moral character or willpower. When Dr. Morrison noticed that some of his patients seemed to require increasing amounts of laudanum, he attributed it to the progression of their underlying conditions, not to the medication itself. This well-meaning ignorance created a perfect storm of unintentional harm. Dr. Morrison continued prescribing increasing amounts of laudanum because his patients reported that smaller doses were becoming ineffective for their original symptoms. What he didn't realize was that opium withdrawal creates many of the same symptoms: anxiety, insomnia, stomach pain, depression, that the drug had originally been prescribed to treat. Meanwhile, Chinese merchants in the old city operated under different assumptions entirely. For them, opium was a traditional medicine, a luxury good and a source of profit, all at once. The elaborate smoking parlors that catered to wealthy clients like John Yu Zhou were businesses based on providing a service that customers clearly wanted and valued. These merchants often developed genuine relationships with their regular customers. They learned to recognize the signs of distress, to adjust the quality and quantity of their products to maintain their clients' function and discretion. Some even tried to discourage excessive use, understanding that maintaining a stable customer base required keeping those customers alive and financially capable. But the economic incentives were all wrong. The more opium someone used, the more profit the merchants made. The more tolerant customers became to the drug, the more expensive varieties they required. The system rewarded escalation and punished moderation. Between the well-intentioned doctors and the profit-motivated merchants stood a vast gray area of people who occupied various roles in Shanghai's opium economy. Importers who told themselves they were meeting legitimate medical demand, shopkeepers who sold pipes and other equipment while maintaining careful ignorance about their use, landlords who rented rooms to smoking establishments while looking the other way about the activities inside. Each person in this chain could point to someone else as the source of the problem while ignoring their own contribution to it. The result was a system where individual moral responsibility became diffused across so many players that no one felt fully accountable for the cumulative harm being done. For each person caught in opium's grip, there came moments of terrible clarity when the full scope of their situation became undeniably clear. These moments of recognition were often more painful than the physical withdrawal, because they required acknowledging not just the present crisis, but all the choices and deceptions that had led to it. For Mei Lin, the moment came on a spring morning. She had been preparing to meet a potential customer who was interested in purchasing several of her paintings, a sale that would provide enough money for Chen Wei to expand his business as he had long dreamed of doing. She had laid out her best work on the table, arranged tea and small cakes, and was waiting for the gentleman to arrive. But the night before, her supply of opium had run out unexpectedly, and by morning she was deep in withdrawal. Her hands shook too violently to hold a teacup steady. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. When the customer arrived, she could barely maintain a coherent conversation. She watched his interest fade as he took in her appearance, her trembling hands, the sweet medicinal smell that clung to her despite her attempts to mask it with perfume. After he left without making any purchases, Mei Lin sat among her paintings, work that represented years of effort and dreams of contributing to her family's prosperity, and realized that she had become someone who could not be trusted with her own life, much less with the hopes and plans of the person she loved most. For James Hartwell, recognition came during a parent conference when Mrs. Patterson, the mother of one of his most promising students, looked at him with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for invalids or children. "Mr. Hartwell," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you quite well? You seem, that is, young Timothy has mentioned that you sometimes seem to be having difficulty in class, and we wondered if perhaps you might need to take some time to rest."
James realized in that moment that his private struggle had become visible not just to adults but to the children in his care. The careful facade he thought he had maintained was transparent to a 12-year-old boy. The professional competence he prided himself on was obviously compromised to anyone paying attention. For Zhou Jianyu, the moment came during a crucial business negotiation with British textile importers. He had been handling the complex discussions well, drawing on years of experience and his natural talent for languages and diplomacy. But as the hours wore on and his last dose of opium wore off, he began to feel the familiar anxiety and physical discomfort creeping in. Without thinking, he excused himself and slipped away to the smoking room attached to the restaurant where they were meeting. Just a few draws, he told himself, just enough to steady his nerves for the final stages of the negotiation. But when he returned to the table, he found his father waiting with the British merchants, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant deep disappointment. "Gentlemen," Zhou Daming said quietly, "I think we should continue this discussion tomorrow when we are all fully present." Jianyu realized that his father had known exactly where he had gone and why. More devastating still, he realized that the British merchants had also recognized his absence for what it was. His carefully maintained reputation for reliability and sharp business sense was crumbling before his eyes. What followed these moments of recognition varied dramatically from person to person, but almost everyone made some attempt to reclaim their life from opium's influence. These attempts reveal both the incredible strength of the human spirit and the devastating power of addiction to corrupt even the most sincere efforts at change. Mei Lin's first attempt at recovery was characteristically gentle and gradual. She convinced herself that she could simply reduce her usage slowly, weaning herself off the drug through careful discipline and willpower. She created elaborate schedules for herself, marking on a calendar the decreasing amounts she would allow herself each day. For the first few days, the plan seemed to work. She managed to reduce her intake slightly, and the pride she felt in maintaining control gave her hope that she could continue the process. But as the amounts grew smaller and the intervals between doses grew longer, the physical and emotional distress became increasingly difficult to bear. Chen Wei, desperate to support his wife's efforts, took leave from his business to stay home during her recovery attempt. He watched her pace their small rooms like a caged animal, saw her weep with frustration when her hands shook too much to hold a paintbrush, held her through nights when she couldn't sleep and days when she couldn't wait. After 2 weeks of gradual reduction, Mei Lin seemed to be making real progress. Her eyes were clearer, her conversation more focused. She had even completed a small painting,
the first new work she had finished in months. But that very success proved to be her undoing. The painting was beautiful, but it lacked the dreamlike quality that had made her recent work so marketable to Western collectors. Staring at the traditional earthbound landscape she had created, Mei Lin felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the opium, but for the transcendent vision it had given her. That night, while Chen Wei slept, she crept out of their apartment and walked to Mrs. Zhang's house. She told herself she would just have a small amount, just enough to recapture the artistic vision she feared losing forever. By morning she was back where she had started. James Hartwell's approach to recovery was more dramatic and initially more successful. Recognizing that gradual reduction had failed him multiple times, he decided on complete cessation. He disposed of all his opium supplies, informed Mrs. Cooper that he would be indisposed for several days, and locked himself in his room to endure whatever withdrawal might bring. The physical symptoms were severe: violent nausea, cold sweats, muscle cramps, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made even lying still feel like hard labor. But worse than the physical distress was the psychological anguish. Without opium's gentle filter, every sound seemed too loud, every light too bright, every emotion too intense. The anxiety that had originally driven him to seek medical help returned with compound interest, bringing with it a depression so profound that getting out of bed required tremendous effort. But James had advantages that many addicts lack. He had education, social support, and genuine employment that he valued. Mrs. Cooper, having recognized his struggle, proved to be an invaluable ally. She brought him simple foods when he could eat, sat with him when the isolation became unbearable, and most importantly, helped him avoid the well-meaning friends and colleagues who would have urged him to take something for his obvious distress. After 10 days of acute withdrawal, James emerged from his room weak but clear-minded for the first time in over a year. The world seemed sharper, more immediate, but also more manageable than he had feared. He returned to his teaching with renewed energy and found that his students responded positively to his increased presence and engagement. For nearly 3 months, James maintained his sobriety through a combination of careful routine, physical exercise, and the support of Miss Cooper and a few trusted friends. He felt proud of his achievement and confident that the worst was behind him. The relapse came during Shanghai's brutal summer heat, a combination of physical discomfort, work stress, and a minor illness created a perfect storm of vulnerability. When Dr. Morrison prescribed laudanum for what appeared to be a stomach ailment, James told himself that he could use it medicinally, just until he felt better, with careful attention to dosage and duration. Within a week, he was using more than he had before his period of sobriety. The disappointment was almost more crushing than the original addiction had been. These efforts reveal both the complexity of the issue and the limitations of addressing addiction without understanding its true nature. The Chinese business community, particularly successful merchants like Zhou Daming, found themselves in an impossible position. Opium use was deeply embedded in their social and business practices, making it difficult to address without seeming hypocritical or threatening important relationships. At the same time, many of them were watching family members and business partners destroy themselves and their enterprises through excessive use. Some merchants attempted to create informal support networks, meeting privately to discuss strategies for helping family members reduce their opium use. These efforts were usually well-intentioned but poorly informed, relying on moral exhortation and willpower rather than any understanding of addiction as a medical condition. Zhou Daming's approach with his son Jiang Yu was typical of these efforts. He attempted to create alternative sources of satisfaction and stress relief, arranging for Jiang Yu to take up calligraphy again, planning family trips to beautiful mountain regions, even discreetly arranging for him to meet potential marriage partners in hopes that romantic attachment might provide motivation for change. When these positive inducements failed, Zhou Daming tried restricting Jiang Yu's access to money and requiring him to account for his time more carefully. But these measures only taught his son to be more secretive and deceptive about his drug use, creating distance between them without addressing the underlying problem. The foreign community's response was equally limited by their understanding of the issue. Most Western doctors continued to view opium primarily as a medicine, failing to recognize that their prescribing practices were often creating the very problems they were trying to solve. When patients like James Hartwell developed obvious signs of dependency, the medical response was usually to suggest moderation or to prescribe alternative medications that were often equally addictive. Some members of the foreign community advocated for moral and legal approaches to the problem. Christian missionaries in particular saw opium addiction as a spiritual failing that could be addressed through religious conversion and moral reformation. While their concern was genuine, this approach often added shame and self-blame to the burden already carried by people struggling with addiction. The legal response was equally problematic. While there were growing calls for restrictions on opium trade and use, enforcement was selective and often counterproductive. Wealthy users like Jiang Yuzhou faced little risk of legal consequences, while poor users were increasingly criminalized and marginalized. Perhaps most tragically, the community responses often focused on controlling access to opium rather than addressing the underlying conditions that made it appealing. Little attention was paid to the isolation, anxiety, cultural displacement and economic pressure that drove people to seek chemical relief in the first place. As the opium crisis continued into the early 1900s, its effects on children and young adults became increasingly apparent. These young people who had grown up watching parents, relatives, and community leaders struggle with addiction developed their own complex relationships with both the drug itself and the behaviors surrounding it. Little Tiger, Miss Jiang's grandson, reached adolescence with an sophisticated understanding of addiction that would have been remarkable in an adult. He could recognize the stages of intoxication, predict when his grandmother would be functional or incapacitated, and manage household responsibilities that should have been handled by adults. But this premature competence came at a cost. Little Tiger struggled with trusting adults, having learned early that even loving caregivers could become unreliable without warning. He excelled in school, partly from genuine intelligence, but also from a deep fear of depending on anyone else for his future security. When Little Tiger was 15, he was offered opium by school friends whose own families were involved in the trade. His refusal was immediate and absolute. He had seen too much to be tempted by the drug itself, but his fear of addiction extended to avoiding many forms of pleasure and relaxation, leaving him isolated and anxious in different ways from his grandmother. In the Zhou family, Jiang Yu's younger sister Mei Feng came of age watching her beloved brother disappear into opium's embrace. She saw how the drug transformed him from the confident, caring older brother she had idolized into someone who was often physically present but emotionally unreachable. Mei Feng's response was to become fiercely protective of her family's reputation and resources. She learned to cover for her brother's absences, to make excuses for his mistakes, and to manage family responsibility he could no longer handle reliably. But she also developed a deep resentment toward him that she struggled to reconcile with her genuine love and concern. When marriage arrangements were made for Mei Feng, she insisted on unusual clauses in the contract that would protect her personal property and give her more autonomy than was typical for women of her class. She had learned not to trust that the men in her life would remain capable of protecting and providing for their family. These young people often showed remarkable resilience and wisdom, but they also carried invisible wounds that would influence their own parenting and relationships for decades to come. They had learned lessons about the fragility of human reliability that made them both more compassionate and more guarded than their peers who had grown up in more stable circumstances. Despite the widespread nature of addiction in old Shanghai, there were individuals who managed to achieve lasting recovery from opium dependency. Their stories provide insight into both the challenges of overcoming addiction and the factors that could make recovery possible. One such person was Dr. Li Zuiming, a traditional Chinese physician who had begun using opium to manage chronic pain from an injury sustained in his youth. As his usage increased over several years, Dr. Li found himself in the terrible position of being unable to effectively treat his patients while managing his own addiction. Dr. Lee's recovery began with a moment of professional crisis, when he made a serious diagnostic error while under the influence of opium. The patient, a young mother with what proved to be appendicitis, nearly died because Dr. Lee's impaired judgment led him to prescribe traditional treatments for what he mistook for a minor digestive disorder. Watching the woman's family keep vigil while she fought for her life, Dr. Lee experienced what he later described as a complete reversal of his understanding of his situation. Instead of seeing opium as medicine that allowed him to function despite his problems, he suddenly saw it as poison that was making him incapable of fulfilling his most sacred responsibility. Dr. Lee's approach to recovery was methodical and incorporated both his medical knowledge and his understanding of traditional Chinese philosophy. He gradually reduced his opium intake while simultaneously building physical and mental practices designed to address the underlying conditions that had made the drug appealing. He returned to regular practice of Tai Chi and meditation, activities he had abandoned as his addiction progressed. He changed his diet to support his body's healing process and began taking herbal preparations designed to ease withdrawal symptoms and restore energy. Most importantly, he enlisted the help of a colleague who agreed to monitor his practice and his well-being during the recovery process. The physical withdrawal was difficult but manageable with his medical